We are really pleased to have Lilia Shevtsova with us to speak about Russia after the Crimea. It's my pleasure and honor to introduce our today's speaker. She is the strongest and I would say the clearest voice that we have today in terms of the analysis of Russian politics, but more specifically the international relations with Russia being at the center. And today's presentation will be dedicated to the latest development in Russia, but also put it in the context of international relations. Lilia Shevtsova, for those of you who maybe don't know her, she is an associate fellow at the Russia and Eurasia program at Chatham House in London. She is this semester a senior scholar at the Davis Center. And she's a founding chair of the Davos World Economic Forum Council on Russia's Future. Lilia Shevtsova is author of a number of important books, publications, and articles, and I will list just some of them. So Yeltsin's Russia, Myths and Reality, Putin's Russia, Russia Lost in Transition, the Yeltsin and Putin Legacies, Lonely Power, Why Russia Has Failed to Become the West and Why the West is Wary of Russia. So again, it's my pleasure to welcome Lilia Shevtsova today with us. We are happy to have her in our Ukrainian Research Institute seminar series, and we are claiming her as ours. For those of you who maybe don't know, Lilia Shevtsova was born in the wonderful city of Lviv. So without further ado, I am turning the floor to Lilia Shevtsova. Please.
Sergey, thanks a lot, really. Well, it's too early. It's too early. Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's pleasure and it's fun, and especially to see in the audience our friends. And you, first of all. It's very difficult for me. It's a great responsibility to give due to the topic in mere, 30, 45 minutes. It's up to you. And I'm not going to test your patience, of course. And I have to admit from the very beginning that I will be dealing with questions that I still am deliberating on, still am fighting on. And to admit that I don't have solutions to many of them, well, I have to admit it from the very beginning. I decided that I would structure my talk, my narrative, in the following way. Firstly, I will discuss the uniqueness of the Russian system of personalized power. Secondly, what role Ukraine or the Ukrainian factor plays in the Russian system's survival. And thirdly, what is sustainability of the Russian system, durability, and what are the drivers that undermine it? So let me start with my first issue, with my first point, the uniqueness of the phenomena. You know, frankly speaking, when I'm observing the Russian system, the regime, the institute, the political scene, opposition, the Kremlin behavior, I am more and more puzzled. And I'm perplexed, frustrated. Because the moment you see the logic, you start to lose the understanding of it. And really, you know, after many years of trying to classify Russia and the Russian state and the Russian phenomena, I came to conclusion that I cannot fit it into any certain slot or category. Russia defies any kind of strict definition. And really, just imagine the phenomena that, on the one hand, yes, still is an empire, but Sergei knows much more about that. Maybe half collapsed, half frozen empire. But on the other hand, this is a petrostate. On the one hand, Russia is one of the architects of the world order, and due to tradition, geography, history, and maybe ineffectiveness of the West, it continues to be one of the key geopolitical actors. And at the same time, the system is in decay. And decay started not after the collapse of the Soviet Union, no. The decay started already after Stalin. Stalin left this political scene and his biological existence. And the system, in the state of decay, degradation, demoralization, still is limping ahead, producing quite a view of mischief, and the system continues to influence not only the international scene, but from what we see during the last years, is trying to impact, to influence the internal life of the Western community and certain countries. Well, and overall, the system that is based on one of the very important driver, militarization, and cannot get out of this militarization cycle, and at the same time cannot pursue real militarization. And the system that has succeeded to revive itself, to re-energize itself by dumping the Soviet state and then mimicking the liberal standards and norms, and then trying to contain them at the same time. And the system that came to be an antithesis of liberal democracy that cannot survive without the West, and is surviving by sucking to the West, by penetrating the West. That's really a phenomenon. And having successfully limping along during the last, more than 20 years, it was kind of dolce vita for Russia and for the Russian authoritarian regime. Suddenly, the Kremlin and Russia come into conclusion that, it cannot go ahead like this. So Ukraine became a benchmark, watershed, that in fact ended one chapter in Russia's history and began a new chapter in Russia's history and in Europeans' history. So the Kremlin tried to make Ukraine a systemic factor of its survival, and instead we see that Ukraine has become an anti-systemic factor, provoking the law of unintended consequences, and in fact becoming the factor that has started to destabilize the Russian system. So now let me turn to the second question that I plan to discuss, to the role of the Ukraine factor and Ukraine in the survival of Russia and the survival of Russian model of personalist power. Several brushstrokes. I will be putting, these issues or points in a way of brushstrokes. First of all, what does Ukraine means for Russia? What kind of test Ukraine can become for Russia? Ironically, I would say and I would argue that Ukraine is not a test for Russia's imperialistic longings. And I would disagree with the person whom I respected very much, with Zbigniew Brzezinski, who said the famous axiom, without Ukraine, Russia will stop being an empire. I would argue that without Ukraine, Russia still could be an empire. But Russia cannot be traditional Russia. So Ukraine, for Russia, is not apparently the subject of area, it's not an area of influence or area of interest. Ukraine, it's first of all the limp part or element of the Russian construct. And in Russian mentality, Ukraine means, first of all, as I see it in Moscow, as I see talking to people in Moscow and in Russia, Ukraine is seen as inevitable element of the Russian state civilization. So, in fact, losing Ukraine would mean that Russians have to start analyzing their own Russian identity, getting rid of Ukraine, and Ukraine jump in the boat of the Russian ship means that we Russians have to start finally to fight with the issue of our national identity without Ukraine. And there is another issue which apparently is very important for us, but not only for us, but also for the post-Soviet space. Ukraine, in fact, I wonder whether you will agree with me or not, Sergei. Ukraine apparently represents totally new model of post-communist transition that differs much from the transition directly from communism in Baltic states, in Eastern and in Central Europe. It was much easier for Poles, Czechs, Hungarians, Balts to make this transformation from communism into a new world, a new paradigm. And especially when there was such a benevolent situation, Europe wanted them. It's much difficult to walk through the valley of tears for Ukrainians and for any other nation, Belarusians, Russians, because after the last 20 years, we have totally new post-communist reality based on merger, fusion between power and property, discreditation of liberal principles and liberal norms that makes the transformation and transition much more difficult. Much more difficult. So if Ukrainians, and there are a lot of problems that they're facing today, and I'm not going to describe Ukrainian domestic issues, well, it's not ethical for a Russian, especially from Moscow, but if Ukraine can make it, then it will be a path, then it will be an example, then it will be a model for Russians, Belarusians, for Caucasian nations and Central Asian nations to follow. So Ukraine is testing a totally different paradigm and model of transition, never experienced by Eastern Europe or by other communist states before. And so this will be apparently a very important a reality and very important experience to follow, to understand, and to observe. And especially in the situation when Ukrainians are trying to undertake their project, their mission, in the situation when Europe is not benevolent as it was before, and Europe is not waiting for them. So could the nation start this type of transformation in the situation when the external factor is not that helpful? So it will be very important for us Russians to see too. Another point, how Ukraine became a factor of survival for the Russian system and for Putin's regime. Of course, and here is, of course, already unanimity between us Russian experts on that issue, and apparently our Ukrainian colleagues would agree with us. Putin and the Kremlin and the whole Russian construct, of course, had to react to Maidan and Yanukovych regime collapse somehow. In some way, the reaction could have been probably more or less dramatic for various reasons. Because, Ukrainians are part of the Russian nation, and, it's already kind of axiom for Russian mentality. This is kind of our tribe. Because personally for Putin, Ukraine has always been a personal, private project, and he has invested a lot of energy into Ukrainian project. Because Ukraine was a key element of the concept that dominated Russian mentality, at least for 5-6 years, concept of Eurasian Union. Without Ukraine, nobody could ever dream about Eurasian Union and this idea already is kicked out, dumped, is not on the Kremlin agenda. So there are a lot of factors, including the fact that, of course, the Kremlin, and it's kind of nightmare even to think about repetition of Maidan, Euromaidan in Russia. So there were different reasons and motives that could have provoked the Kremlin reaction. But at the same time, we have to raise again, having some new information, some, already understanding of reality. We have to raise again the question, to what extent Crimea was inevitable? To what extent the Russian war with Ukraine was unavoidable? For the time being, at least, we can define at least two factors that made the Russian-Ukrainian gambit, if I can use this kind of word, possible. The first factor is strictly domestic factor. In 2011, 2012, Putin lost a lot of his approval rating. And after elections in 2012, it was a president who was driving to the Kremlin along empty streets of Moscow that was hostile to him, that was alien to him. And he understood. Putin definitely understood. He's a smart political being, a smart political animal. He had to understand the drama and maybe tragedy of his situation. Moscow against him, St. Peter against him. Yes, there were only 200,000 people on the streets before his elections, but still he had to feel that even part of the Kremlin gang, part of the Russian political elite, was ready, in case the tide was rising, was ready to betray him. So the problem of his new legitimacy, the problem of support for his new regime, for his new presidency, it was a crucial problem and his nightmare. And thus, in this situation, when the president could not get support of more than 65%, of course he was thinking about new legitimacy idea, new consolidation idea. And Yanukovych collapse and Maidan gave such a pretext to form the new basis, the new legitimacy, on the basis of military patriotism. New legitimacy by kicking the country into the war paradigm. And by the way, the idea of the besieged fortress for Russia, the idea of war with the United States was not that crucial at that time. In 2014, at least through the end of that year, the most important for the Kremlin was, unification of Russians, return back of our Crimea, and return back of Ukrainians threatened by Banderovцы. And the second factor, what was the second factor that influenced the Kremlin decisions in these months of 2004, the spring of 2004? The second factor is lying on the table. And this factor is very important. It's very important when we are thinking about the roots, motives of the Russian foreign policy, especially during these fateful years that changed the whole, I would say, European security order. The second factor was the Kremlin's conviction that the West, Americans, and the key European actors, especially Germany, nobody cared about France, UK, and the rest of Europeans. Germany was crucial. So the Western actors will stomach Crimea annexation and will stomach the Kremlin's desire to create the new legitimacy. And this conviction, cockiness, self-assuredness, had been already formalized and defined between 2012 and the end of 2013 in the updated foreign policy concept. And the key premise of this concept was not humiliation from the West, that the Russian rhetoric is constantly, concentrating itself. No, but the idea that the West is over, basta, point blank. The mission of the West is over. It is surviving through the final stage of its decay, very, very Spenglerian. That's why, our goal, our agenda is to fill the gap. It's our time, guys, before Chinese, of course, interfere. And we know already from different leaks from the Kremlin at that period that, yes, it was Putin's initiative. It was his decision, and a lot of people on board of the National Security Council and people around him were raising concerns and even doubts, serious doubts, saying, apparently, Vladimir Vladimirovich, what are you going to do? But, the West will react. There will be sanctions. This is up to you to solve the problem. So even the elite, even people close to Putin, apparently, from what we see now, we're not quite sure that it was the real stuff to do. It should not have been done. But cockiness and assuredness provoked by the Western policy before 2014, and of course, first of all, the Kremlin's attitude and reaction to the President Obama presidency, and to the President Obama policy of leading from behind, strategic pause, etc., convinced the Kremlin that we could go ahead. So two factors became an impetus for the Russian breakthrough, and for the first, that Putin decided to risk and kick over the global chessboard. Of course, history has no subjective mood, and hardly we could say what would have happened if, for instance, the external factor was missing. What could have happened if not Putin lost popularity and approval rating in 2011, 2012? But it happened. What happened, happened. But we have to take into account the two factors that were crucial when the Kremlin was undertaking this fateful for Russia, for Ukraine, for Europe decision. Next point. Crimea annexation, Donbas war. What are the repercussions? As we see them now, at least as I see it now from my Moscow window. Let me very briefly to recall or to remind you that Russian policy in Ukraine, starting with the beginning of 2014, has been evolving from one stage to another. So the first stage, and here the period is quite short, the period that I can call, at least tentatively, Novorossiya, New Russia, March, September 2014. What was the goal of the Kremlin during this period? Very short period. It was very ambitious agenda at this time. On the basis of Crimea victory, successful Crimea annexation, euphoria, the Russian authorities thought that historical Russian-speaking lands are points of weakness, and the Russian operational planning included Kharkiv, Dnipropetrovsk, Mariupol, Zaporizhzhia, and Odessa. Very soon it proved that these assumptions were quite wrong, and the Kremlin changed its strategy and tactics by September 2014, rejecting the idea and the concept of Novorossiya and the Russian world. And starting with September 2014 through 2015, the end of 2015, another stage comes. Tentatively, we can call it federalization. The attempt of the Kremlin was to force the West, and first of all, the signatories of the Minsk Accord agreements, and behind them the United States of America, to agree to the Russian interpretation of the Minsk Accord and help Moscow to incorporate the separatist republics into the Ukrainian body, and force Ukrainians to accept the Russian understanding of federalization. And there are some periods when the Western partners and the Western signatories in Berlin and Paris were nearly ready to accept the Russian interpretation of the Accord. And here we are coming to the third phase number 3, that continues today. It started in 2015, the end of 2015. Putin has started to look for compromise, for exit solution. Moscow understood that the previous premises, quite a few of them, were a mistake. Moscow has to get out of that. Moscow has to get out of the Ukrainian trap. Point blank. How to get out of that? But without losing face, without humiliating itself. So starting with 2015, we have already 2 years of different gimmicks, tricks, because the Kremlin playbook includes, some pretty inventive ways and instruments. But during these 2 years, the Kremlin has been hard and desperately trying to put Ukraine behind, to force the West to forget about Ukraine. And Syria gambit, another gambit in 2015. Why Syria? Why in 2015? There are different reasons of this Syrian adventure and Syrian interference, but the key goal of the war, of the Russian interference in Syria, was to return back to the dialogue with the key foreign policy actors, to get out of isolation, marginalization, to return the role of the great power, and to put Ukraine behind. Partially, Putin has succeeded. Maybe not with Ukraine, not with this goal, but with some other goals. But in any case, Syria allowed Putin and the Kremlin to return back to the table, especially with Americans. And the current situation of the last 3 weeks demonstrates that the Kremlin has been pretty successful with Syria plan, pretty successful in forming the new mission for President Putin, the mission of the peacemaker. And contradictory repercussions of Ukraine. On the one hand, definitely, the Kremlin succeeded. The Kremlin succeeded in raising Putin's approval rating. It became skyrocketing. Crimea annexation, Nash Krim, Krim Nashism, Crimea annexation became the key idea of consolidation of the Russian society, putting all other things, domestic worries and problems, on the back burner. And it gave some kind of impetus to Putin's presidency, cockiness, self-assuredness, new adrenaline into his blood. But at the same time, most important is another thing. Somewhere in 2016, this Crimea annexation adrenaline started to fade. People got tired of that, and other consequences became quite apparent. The international space for Russia has limited. Sanctions have started to bite. Just one number in 2014, at the middle of 2014, Russia had approximately 68.9 billion of FDI, foreign direct investments. By mid of 2015, Russia had only $6 billion of FDI. So you see the difference. Sanctions became very painful, despite of the fact that Kremlin still does not recognize, does not admit it. And even more important was the fact that both, starting with 2015, 2016, both the elite and the society started to demonstrate fatigue. Fatigue with the Kremlin's policy towards Ukraine, with the war, and the people have started to raise unpleasant questions. So it became evident that Ukraine, from the factor that had to strengthen the system and the regime, has started to be a factor that already was destructive, has started to undermine the system and the regime. Next point, what the Russian elite and people are thinking about Ukraine, about Crimea annexation, and the war in Donbass. We can rely upon our own feelings, and we can rely upon the results of the polls. Well, results of the polls, even, Levada polls, cannot explain the whole cognitive dissonance of the people's mentality, but still, this is the only instrument that helps us to understand at least the trends, the trajectory. Crimea annexation still is considered, so this is the latest polls, is considered to be a sacred cow. Well, criticism of annexation, very often involves punishment. 63% of Russians say that Crimea annexation brought more good, more positive things. But already 21% say that Crimea annexation brought negative results. But here is one more poll that for me is fascinating, really fascinating. 2 weeks ago, only 2% of Russian respondents mentioned Crimea annexation as Putin's achievement. 2% consider it Putin's achievement. 2%. So, in fact, what we see, people have started already to rethink to what extent they need this annexation and pay for annexation. What is even more important, there are different other polls, indirect, that say that Russians are not ready to sacrifice, to pay price for the Russian foreign policy, for the great power role, and for war in Ukraine. With respect to Donbass, the number of people that are in fact support fast exit from the war in Donbass and Ukraine is growing. At the moment, 41% of Russian respondents say that Russia should support the separatist republics. 6% already, 6% support the Kyiv government, and 37% of Russians say that Russia should not support any political force in Donbass. And only 11% of Russians believe or insist both that Russia and Ukraine have to be one state. So in mentality of Russians, Ukrainians are already moving towards, independent states. Let them be. We don't want them, to be a hostile country. It's already emergence of a new type of identity. Slowly, gradually, at the beginning, but still. And the last, my Ukrainian point. What about Kremlin's search for exit? So we see that Russia is preparing for new presidential elections. We see that the Kremlin has been looking actively and energetically for the new idea of the presidency. What idea, what could be the idea of Putin's election campaign? He still didn't issue an official statement, but he's running. Of course he's running. Everybody is quite sure that he's running. So what's the idea of the new presidency? Is it, still the war? People do not want war. People do not want even to watch the TV programs describing, how Ukrainians, how awful Ukrainians are, etc. People are not interested in that. People have started to look into their refrigerators. So, at the moment, the idea is Putin has to be the president of the peace-loving country. So this is the idea now, just the end of November. And President Putin has to run as the peacemaker. So here, he suggests the Syria peace plan. And while he was talking to President Trump, during 1 hour, I wonder what else they discussed, but they definitely discussed Syria and Ukraine. And apparently, Putin was trying to force the typically Russian way of negotiating, because according to the Russian political tradition, Kremlin always makes a deal, connecting, linking the issues. Linkage, that's the most important element of the trade dealing on the part of the Kremlin. Whereas Americans try to divide. One bargain on that, another bargain on that. At some point, Obama said, no compartmentalization when we are dealing with Russians. There should be the linkage. So apparently there is some idea that if we now reach some kind of consensus with Americans regarding Syria, and Russia has very strong position on Syria, and especially having these smiling guys behind Rouhani and Erdogan with their knives in their pockets, but still Putin has the major hand. Maybe we can somehow involve Ukraine as a part of the bargaining process. And maybe Americans will help us, firstly, to get out of this mess, but on our terms. First of all, when we are talking about peacekeeping forces along the border of division between Ukraine and the separatist republics, but not along the border between Ukraine and Russia. If this is done, then Russia could still influence the election, of new authorities in Ukraine that could be a member of the new Ukrainian Duma, enforcing the role of the oppositional bloc. So this is apparently one of the ideas, is one of the goals. I'm talking about November 2017. And in fact, we see clear desire on the part of the Russian team to escape escalation. We see that it's very difficult for Moscow to keep hands in the pockets. Yes, it's difficult not to, beef the macho muscles, etc. But, the idea is to present President as the peacekeeper and not to aggravate the moods within the Trump administration and within European capitals. Well, and the logic is Russia needs some kind of compromise decision. It's logical for the survival of the system. And Putin has to return back to new normalcy. What kind of normalcy is it? To the old model, model that worked so brilliantly before 2014. To be with the West, to be inside of the West, and to be against the West, okay? So Russia wants to return to the model that allows Russia to use the Western resources for its economy. So this is the goal. And so bargain and grand bargain with the West about Ukraine is simply, a logical thing. But at the same time, you can ask a question, especially looking at the situation in Donbass, what's happening now in Donbass. You can ask a question. But what about the traditional instrument of Russian politics? That we could call coercive dating, when the Kremlin throws stones into the window, escalating the risks, forcing the opponent or the partner to accept the Kremlin's team. This has been such a wonderful, such a successful instrument of doing politics for decades for the Kremlin. Well, can the Kremlin switch to another modality or not? Hardly. And besides, there is a question of probable miscalculations. And here it's very interesting for those who are curious about what's going on between Kurt Volker and Surkov. This is the recent, have you read it? This is the recent interview of Kurt Volker. Well, recent. This is the only interview that he gave. To Politico, my favorite Politico, to Susan Glasser. It's very interesting because we really don't know what's happening between Kurt Volker and Surkov when they're negotiating some kind of exit solution from Donbass. They had 3 meetings. We don't know any information. We don't have this information. But, theoretically looking at Putin, one could say Putin wants peace. And we are ready for some kind of compromise because finally the Kremlin accepted the idea of peacekeeping forces. We always rejected this idea, Russian side. And, one can have a kind of hope that maybe something positive is moving. So what Kurt Volker is saying? Kurt Volker says, a couple of days ago, yes, he says, we had a hope, we Americans had a hope that something positive is moving. We had a hope that Russians really want to get out and they forgot about escalating. And he said the 3rd meeting with Surkov just recently in Serbia. In Serbia, yes, proved.
Belgrade.
Belgrade, yes. This meeting proved that no way, Russians are not ready to backtrack. Russians are not ready to discuss any compromise options. Russians are ready only to go ahead, to intimidate, and to achieve their goals, probably by other means. And he says there is 80% of probability that there could be a military solution. Looking at this from Moscow, well, I'm here for 2 months, but looking from Moscow, I would say nobody in Moscow now would agree with Kurt Volker. Everybody would say that there is a probably 15, maybe 20% probability of military solution, because this is the moods of the elites. Nobody wants it. This is the moods of the society before the elections. Who wants war before the election? So Kurt Volker says, no, 80% that there will be new military solution. So this is up to Kurt Volker. His view contradicts what we see, what we feel as a logic. But let's leave this question open because really, we don't know what's happening on the ground. We know only one thing. Before March 2018, the Kremlin wants some kind of solution there. And whether the Kremlin will use this instrument from the playbook or that, we still don't know. But again, my conviction is the Kremlin people do understand the gravity of the sanctions. The Kremlin people do understand how negative impact is of the sanction regime on the Russian economy. They do understand that they cannot allow new sanction package. But apparently, and this is my speculation, but apparently, while looking at the scenarios and options that are on the table related to Ukraine, Putin is thinking about the following. Come on, this could be the best or maybe the last historical pause that I have. Trump, we shouldn't care about Trump. Europe is in paralysis. EU, Brussels, does not exist as the entity with some kind of coherent foreign policy. The most important is not even Brexit. The most important is Germany. Angela has problems. We can use it because Merkel is not ready to support a new reproduction of the sanction package. Maybe this is the assumption of possible much more militaristic and assertive policy regarding Ukraine. This is the possibility. And the last. Do you have 7 minutes?
Yes, sure.
Thank you. I don't want to insist, but still I have to end it.
You do.
Well, I feel that I need somehow, even for myself, to wrap up this Ukrainian part of my talk. So what do we have now? We have the law of unintended consequences on the Russian side. What I mean here? I mean that Russia has achieved unthinkable. Russia has provoked European cohesion and Western unity, which hardly anyone in the Kremlin had been thinking about before. Secondly, at the same time, Russia's reliance upon American policy and belief, hope, that America will continue Obama course towards Ukraine appears to be wrong. Trump, despite of all this zigzagging and kind of, well, I'm not going to define Trump's foreign policy, but, it's pretty difficult. All hopes that Trumpian administration will be even much softer, or at least will be Obama-like, proved to be wrong. The current U.S. administration on Ukrainian issue appears to be much more tough, much more assertive than one could have ever predicted, than Obama could have ever risked to do. And for instance, the fact that the American Congress, but I understand that, well, the role of the American Congress, the fact that American Congress limited possibilities of Trump's maneuver in Russian direction, well, it also matters, but the fact that the US Congress approves $500 million for military assistance to Ukraine, this is the fact. The fact that both Mattis and even Tillerson, can you imagine Tillerson, who has been dreaming and sleeping all the time, Tillerson, as we know for sure, he supports the military package of $49 million of lethal assistance to Ukraine. This is the fact. And, nearly all Russia and European hands around Trump support this idea of military assistance to Ukraine just now. It's another thing, what kind of influence it will produce on the negotiations between Moscow and the West about Donbas, it's another issue. But the fact that, with the exception of Trump, everybody around is ready to bring to Ukraine javelins. Yes, well, we know also Trump's position. There are so many leaks and speculations, and Trump's administration appears to be the most open among all administrations because we know nearly everything that is happening maybe in their loose. We know also that Trump said, why not? Well, if we read all this analysis, people that are close, and there are not only leaks, but serious people are saying about that why not? Only let Ukraine pay for that. Well, which is probably an unpleasant thing for Ukrainians. Well, to pay for this 48 million package of weapons. But if you take into account that Ukraine all the same has to pay $38 billion, for loans, and it has only $5 billion in the National Bank, well, it could be somehow prolongated into the future, the payment. But the most important thing is Trump's administration is much more assertive on the issue of Ukraine. This is secondly. Thirdly, the second point is positive for Ukraine, but third point is pretty negative for Ukraine. And I'm talking about European unity on sanctions. Europe still reproduces sanctions, but who knows what the new government and when the new government in Germany will be composed, and what the new government, and especially if this government is with social democrats, what kind of position it will take on sanctions. We don't know. But Merkel's position has been weakened, and she hardly, maybe yes, maybe no, whether she could keep sanction unity of Europe in the next half of the year, we don't know. But we know one important thing, that Europeans forced Americans to cut demands to Russia when Americans accepted the August Sanction Act. And Gazprom and Nord Stream and some other companies are excluded from the US and Western sanctions. We know that for sure. Why? Because Americans said we don't want to quarrel with Europe. And yes, it's low denominator for unity, but apparently we are not going to increase problems for Russia in this area, especially when these problems could be created for our European partners. So what will be European unity regarding Ukraine is a big question mark. Too many unknowns. But at the same time, there is fourth point. The Russian society and elites are tired of the war with Ukraine. They don't want to continue it. They want the end. They want to put the end to this war. And the final thing is the current Russian leadership that has legitimized itself, the political regime and its policy, by turning to military patriotism and turning to a Crimea annexation element, has serious problems to get out of this trap. And probably only new political leadership will have much more field for maneuver. And the final part, very briefly, because while I'm already testing your patience, but I will do that. On the logic of Russian system, several brush points. Firstly, does the Kremlin really want confrontation with the West at the moment? The answer is no. The problem for the Kremlin, for the current political regime, and for Putin privately, somehow to return to the previous policy of accommodation, of adaptation, of personal integration of the Russian political elite and commercial elite into the West. And the Russian elite definitely doesn't want Russia to turn into North Korea. What about the Russian society? Russian society, here's cognitive dissonance. On the one hand, the Russian society supports foreign policy of President Putin. On the other hand, this is very important, on the other hand, only 18% of Russians would like containment of America, and 14% of Russians would like any actions like expansion, areas of interest, of influence, etc., etc. And 46, 47, up to 50% of Russians, maybe even more now, I would say, consider great power status for Russia that they support, not, as a status based on military might, but the status of country that is pursuing, economic interests of the country. So a different notion of the great power started to emerge. Secondly, what is the Kremlin foreign policy agenda now? Well, I would say that if we define it theoretically, it's, the attempt to force the West to accept some kind of a hybrid between new Versailles system based on sovereignty, territorial integrity, non-interference, and at the same time postmodernity, which would allow Russia and the Kremlin to interpret the key rules of the game in its own way. Very Putinesque. Thirdly, what's happening on the domestic scene? The campaign, Putin definitely will win. Well, the agenda is to get 70% of turnout and 70% of votes in favor of Putin. It can be done with different manipulations. The problem is nobody in the Kremlin, nobody knows what to do next. Nobody knows how to deal with the pile and economic, social, and all other problems that Russia is facing. And what are the prospects for the Russian system? This is last point. Well, when I will liberate you. We have to acknowledge and to admit that there are powerful factors and drivers that help the system, the current system, and the regime to reproduce itself. And I would mention the most important of them, lack of political alternative and lack of political forces that could produce such a political alternative. And secondly, the anti-reformist force, the systemic liberals that are working for the government, for the Kremlin, and discredit liberalism. And also the fact that the elite, very pathetic, is afraid of any change. And of course, demoralized society. Only 7% of Russians are ready to take part in the actions of protest. Well, it's minority, not many people, still could be important in big cities, but overall, society is very demoralized. But here are the drivers that became apparent that undermine the system. Firstly, the Russian society proved that it's not totalitarian anymore. 48% are ready to fight against the state if the state subjugates the interests of individual. 56% say that the country needs opposition. More than 22 million of people are living outside of the state. No connection to the state. Free people. No paternalism. Well, at least among them. So, a lot of people apparently are ready to accept the new rules of the game if they're offered to them. And here is our Russian difference with Ukrainians. Ukrainians are ready to take to Maidan, to the street, in order to demand and form these rules of the game, whereas Russians are still waiting when the political alternative is formed from the top. Another factor that is undermining the system, state has shrinking resources, and, hardly enough in 2018, 2019 for handouts and bribery of the population, and growing people's discontent, especially in the regions. And now we have the younger generation coming to the streets, not in majority, but even 10% of the younger generation between 18 years and 24 years of age who are unsatisfied with the current regime. It's a powerful instrument and powerful resource. And now we have, for the first time during the last 25 years, rather strong pressure on the part of the West. And we have to think what will happen on February, especially February 2nd, when the U.S. Treasury Department publishes its list of 70 people. So far, those 70 people on the list, could be much more. That will be probably the people close to the Kremlin power, members of their families, who will be published, who will constitute the list of corrupted Russian elites, and how Russia will respond to that. So now we see, and really well, and we feel it in Moscow and in other cities, we feel that the country is different. Not many formal signs that say that this country is totally different, but there are so many bumps beneath the surface. The country is becoming grumpy, angry, and the anger is rising. Dissatisfaction, frustration. The question that remains open for many of us, well, for me at least, will the rising tide, and nobody doubts that the rising tide of anger, protest, dissatisfaction, frustration is coming in the next 1, 2, 3, 5 years. It's inevitable. So many interests are looking for articulation and no channels for them. So, the society will be boiling at some point. The problem is whether this tide of wrath and anger produce structural political alternative to the regime, or it will produce a new savior, and we will end not with the end of the system, but only change of the regime that will help to prolongate the system. So this is the question that remains open. And of course, any change that we are looking for could be different. But now people, at least, from my trips to the regions, I can make a conclusion that people do understand that their destiny, it's not a problem of chance, it's the problem of their choice. So while it seems to me some moment of truth is coming for Russia, and definitely this moment of truth will have an impact not only on Russia, on Ukraine, on European security, and apparently on the global security as well. Thank you. I'm sorry that I, did it, for such a long time, but I had to deliver all my points.
We certainly all enjoyed the presentation. Thought-provoking, and again, I will use my power as a moderator to ask the first question. First of all, I agree with you that the question of Russian-Ukrainian relations better understood in the context of the redefinition of national identity than the imperial redefinition and imperial struggles per se. One of those things is, of course, that Crimea, where ethnic Russians are the majority, is attached to the Russian Federation, when the Donbass, where they are not, is not attached. And again, that's an important factor that points in certain directions in the way how Russia imagines itself and imagines its borders. But one thing that came with Crimea, which came with the war, hybrid war in Donbass, was the rise of Russian nationalism and instrumentalization of that nationalism outside of the borders of the Russian Federation. Now it comes back with Girkin, with Mrs. Poklonskaya, and my question is about the Russian nationalism in today's Russia. Whether when the moment of truth comes, do you think that can be one of the contenders for the force that will present an alternative, or it's not ready? To what degree Russian nationalism still can be manipulated, or to what degree it's already an independent force?
Actually, it seems to me it's a very important question, and Igor, where is Igor? Well, he was here. Well, he also participated in discussion of this question. My feeling, because on many issues one still has a feeling but not conviction. My feeling is, firstly, Putin does understand the role of possible role of nationalism for the destiny of Russian multi-ethnic states, and he's very much afraid of nationalism. There are efforts, not successful, I would say, not successful to use nationalism to support the regime before Crimea. Well, because in fact, majority of Russian organized nationalist groups, ethnic nationalism including, they were anti-Putin and anti-Kremlin. Well, there were thousands of people taken to the street in the fall before 2014 of Russian nationalists with predatory slogans, well, not only against migrants, etc., but against Putin. Russian nationalism, including Russian ethnic nationalism, until 2014 was anti-systemic, anti-regime, anti-Putin. And among these people was rather limited group. I knew these people. They are fragmented just now. We call this Natsdem, National Democrats. And ironically enough, National Democrats, well, I don't accept their ideology, but National Democrats were the first in the Russian discourse, the first. And this is a slap in the face of us, to us liberals. They were starting to say, the problem is not only those personalities on the top. The problem is Yeltsin's constitution. It's your presidential constitution. We need to change the constitution because it puts the president above the frame and not, it is uncontrollable, So while they were raising essential questions, and there was, raising the questions to what extent Northern Caucasus and especially Chechnya, being a different civilizational entity, could be, a part of the Russian Federation, being I would say, being antagonistic civilization entity. So these were National Democrats. Crimea, an annexation of Crimea, in fact, was a burial site for Russian nationalism. It fragmented them because partially, well, they accepted Crimea, partially they were just squashed because the leaders of Russian nationalism, at least, 5 or 7, the key leading echelon is in prison right now. The leaders of Russian nationalism are in prison. The leaders of Russian liberals are not, thank God. But, the crackdown on nationalism only says that the Kremlin really is very much afraid of them and understands limits of manipulating. Girkin, Poklonskaya, well, yes, they are puppets on the string, but they represent minority without any kind of popular support. Well, of course, there is another type of nationalism, imperialistic nationalism, and the Kremlin tries to massage it and support it. But if we look, and I just, went to see not participated, went to see how many people take to the street, on Poklonskaya Gorod, this imperialistic nationalism. They came and they're being paid. They came, по разнарядке, as we say, on the list, and hardly there are more than 2,000, 3,000 people. So the Kremlin has problems to collect this imperialistic nationalism. So in fact, nationalism so far is not the resource of power, number one. Secondly, nationalism has no strategic agenda now after being cracked down, okay? And thirdly, Russian nationalism of democratic persuasion, apparently, could raise some very important questions. For instance, the future of the Russian state, whether Russia has to be still an empire or Russian Federation or nation state. Liberals are not introducing these questions. So to some extent, these questions are useful for discourse, but only for discourse. And I wouldn't exaggerate the potential and possibilities of various groups of Russian nationalism.
Who are the leaders of the National Democrats? Nazdem, yeah, I understand.
Well, I will send to you, because now at the moment they've been cracked down in 2014. The younger people, well, partially Valery Solovey was partially, belonging to that. But the rest were young people between 25, 35 years old. Some of them were working for a high school of economics, for instance. But they in fact, they were pretty good on several issues. They were the first who raised the questions about the nature of the Russian constitution.
Okay, well, thank you. I'm opening now floor for questions. Dmitry, please.
Dmitry Dornberg. I have at the very beginning, or almost the very beginning, you made a remark that Russia is unable to pursue real militarization. And I wanted you to expand on that, because subsequently you talked a lot about patriotic militarization, and also right now we see a lot of expansion of capabilities of the Russian military.
Yeah.
So I just was wondering what you had in mind about that.
Dima, thank you for your question. And of course, well, I could ask you to make comments because, well, you're really very respected specialist on military issues. My response to you is the following. I strongly believe, and there is one person who is really an expert on Russian militarization cycles, not from the point of view of weaponry, but from the point of view style of rule, psychology, mentality, Igor Klyamkin, who first invented the concept of Russia's militarization as the key element of the Russian state. Well, and I strongly believe that he's right. It seems to me in history, and I'm looking at Nina, my friend, to Martin, with fear, because she knows Russian history much better than I will ever do. But it seems to me that Russian history, at least starting with the 16th century, in fact, has been evolving from one military cycle to another, and some interval between the wars. Wars that were, even if either victorious or defeats, but in any case, after war, after some pause, another cycle of militarization came. And when I'm talking about militarization, it's, I'm not talking about weaponry and the militarization of the budget. I'm talking about rule of governance when it happened only twice, it seems to me, the world history, with Inks and Sparta, when the ruling elite turns the state and society into the garrison that survives and operates on the basis of order, of the military imperative. And so brilliantly, Stalin repeated this formula and made the Soviet Union the example of the military state when we are talking about the style of life. And for instance, when this week the Krasnoyarsk Legislative and Krasnoyarsk Mayor Office gives the assignment to all schools of Krasnoyarsk to introduce военная подготовка, the military training, in order to insert military, psychology into the minds of the first grade students. It's the return to this military state, not from the point of view military budget, no, but from the point of view returning to the state as garrison.
It's almost a kind of totalitarianism. is what
Well,
you're saying.
it's a very interesting. This totalitarianism does not mean apparently total control over everything. Probably, we'll be moving in this direction. But at the time, it's returned to the symbols and signs of the military psychology. The whole world is against us. We have to defend ourselves, okay? We have to, to teach our younger generation how to fight, etc., etc. So this is returned to the Soviet symbols, well, in the situation when we don't have any other. But in fact, what we have, Dima, it's a very interesting question. Maybe for you can supply it with numbers. On the one hand, the Russian elite that has been incorporated personally into the West, they in fact are uneasy with Russia as a military power because it is toxic power. It hinders their projects and their life in the West, their life in Londongrad. When they have behind them toxic, assertive military power with nukes in Kaliningrad, it hurts. They don't want it, but they don't have another model. So on the one hand, we reach the end of the militarization cycle. On the other hand, we cannot get out of that. It's probably the worst situation. We cannot move ahead and we cannot stop. So this is a kind of, I will use Zygmunt Bauman. It's a kind of, Zygmunt Bauman stole this idea from Gramsci, of course. It wasn't his idea. We are in a kind of interregnum, time out of time, when we exhausted the previous paradigm, but the elite is not ready to invent a new one. And when everything can happen, everything.
Thank you. Alisa, please. Yes.
Alisa Sopova, a visiting scholar in the center. I'm sorry, I have two questions, a proper one and a small one. A proper one, the presidential
An
elections.
improper one. Let's go with improper.
Improper one is you referred to military solution. I wonder what exactly is meant by military solution at this stage. And I will practice quickly for the proper one too. Okay?
Yeah, Alisa, I use the words of Kurt Volker when he said that.
So what do you think?
Read Kurt Volker's interview when he says that according to his thinking process, there is 80% that Russia will use the same military means and military solution in Donbass. What Kurt meant, well, we have to ask Kurt, but if we take into account the previous military solutions, well, the Donbass situation from inside, and apparently you can be much more eloquent discussing the military solutions. Hardly, we are talking about direct involvement of the Russian troops crossing the borders from the Rostov region, like the Russian troops did in 2014 and in 2015, just during the Minsk Accord negotiations. Hardly. But if this is true, because, we rely on very, I would say, random information. For instance, what's happened in Lugansk. Plotnitsky ran away. People just like, these green soldiers, polite guys, took over control over Lugansk. And only now, a couple of days ago, in fact, yesterday, we are coming to conclusion on the basis probably reliable information that it was Vechika Wagner, okay? Because we have different units, Russian units, that are not strictly regarded as part of the Russian army or military structures. Let Dima explain it to you, fighting in Syria and many casualties. And we have funds not in the budget, but for instance, there is such funny company, Gazprom Neftegas, for instance, or something else, with huge funds, secret, classified funds. Apparently, they could be used in order to accommodate these troops that we call Vechika Wagner. In any case, this kind of new type of Dima, how you can call them? They are not troops, in fact.
They're paramilitaries.
paramilitary, not volunteer, because, well, they're volunteers to some extent. Huh?
No,
Paratroopers.
they're mercenaries.
Mercenaries. Well,
companies
mercenaries.
or-
Well, in our literature, they're called volunteers, well, quote unquote, whatever. Anyway, so this is the way, at least, of how something could be done. Lugansk, Plotnitsky, and apparently Vechika Wagner. Well, but I don't believe that the Kremlin will get out of their minds, and there will be repetition of 2015. I don't believe it. Because this will mean directly European unity, Germany taking over, social democrats in Germany, well, forget about their Ostpolitik, and it will give some cards to Trump that we'll have to use. But again, who will ever predict Crimea?
Yeah, this is a good point. This is a good point. So there
sorry.
are limitations to our
I had another question about the presidential elections in Ukraine, which also come in, and like.
Oh,
how it can
I'm not
influence
making
this
any
or-
comments on Ukraine domestic life.
Okay.
I'm Russian.
Oh, which one? You. I think go ahead.
Yeah, I didn't see actually any other hand but yours, Mikhail.
We share the name, so
Okay.
that's a problem.
Misha has a second name already.
Well, thank you very much for this insightful presentation. I have a couple of questions, all proper, I promise. And they go back to some of the details of your talk. The idea of decay that you actually mentioned.
The idea?
The idea of decay that you've been
Decay.
that you mentioned at the beginning and towards the middle. So first you said that the current system is in decay, and it has been in decay since Stalin's death. My question then, of course, is don't you believe that this idea to some extent plays into the hands of neo-Stalinists? And then wouldn't you also say that for somebody who accepts the Putin's regime or lives in Russia, not actively, not an enthusiast, but simply accepts without necessarily criticizing it, this person is in a position of almost, of almost actually wanting to go back to the time, when the system was still at its peak. If the system is in decay, the question is, to what extent, in your opinion, the present representatives of it are aware? If they are aware, how does it square with the second point that you made, namely that according to in Putin's imagination or the imagination of policymakers, it's the West that is in decline. That's to say, how do they square those two notions of being in decline and also of dealing with the system that they are actually trying to replace that is also palpably in decline?
You have several questions in one. I will try to give some logic to my answer, of course, not to your questions. Firstly, it's very difficult for me to understand what the people that are close to the decision making are thinking about the current stage of the system or systemic survival. To what extent they do understand that the situation is not positive. But there are some indirect signs that allow us to make a conclusion that these people could have their mythology, these people could have their inadequacy, well, that is reflected very often in some of their actions. For instance, an action, the desire to do Novorossiya in Ukraine, definitely fatal decision based on mistake, yes? But at the same time, they do understand the situation is not that benevolent in Russia, in economy, in social development, etc., and that their positions are quite threatened. For instance, the creation of Rosgvardia, National Guard, that is the most powerful internally domestic power resource of the Kremlin, says that it has some motive behind, that apparently the Kremlin really thinks that there are serious domestic threats. Well, because, otherwise, well, you could be satisfied with the internal domestic troops and MVD. This is firstly. Secondly, the fact that before the elections, all major institutions now, they're given the temnik, we call it temnik, they're given agenda to make situation better. And the statistical bureau that is working for the government is now subordinated to the government and has no information, independent information about the state of the Russian economy. It says that, definitely they have something to hide. There are different sides that they have something to hide. The fact that Putin is now making a kind of Maoist cadre revolution, getting rid of many governors and sending new people and new faces into the regions who have no connection and a linkage to this region, also says that it's a kind of preventive step, that he would like to have much more loyal leadership in the regions before something unpleasant happens. Besides, they have real social polls that they use every week on the every week basis. And apparently these every week polls give them some understanding what's happening in the regions. So they, in fact, to wrap this up, in fact, they apparently have some more or less adequate situation, that the system has no economic resources. Secondly, that social problems are piling. I don't think that they're using the word decay, degradation, demoralization.
You use the word.
This is my word. Secondly, their conviction, or do they really believe that the West is in decay? I would say I would trust Lavrov, and I would trust Putin, and I would trust key foreign policy speakers in Russia during the last 2 years, before at least summer this year, when they really thought, after having rather intensive experience of dealing with Western leaders, starting with Chirac, ending with Schroeder, and then Blair, Berlusconi, and Obama, that the Western leaders can be manipulated, that the Western leaders can be, and especially the case of Sarkozy,
Deceived.
can be, yes, manipulated, deceived, ignored, and they could be blackmailed. Because during the last, I would say, 5 or 6 years, the policy of blackmail has been pretty successful. And it seems to me they made some mistakes because, well, they never expected, I'm talking about the people in the Kremlin, they never expected the sanction package in Europe. They never expected European coherence, and they never expected that they will have such unpleasant moments and unpleasant gestures on the part of Trump's administration. So they make a mistake.
Thank you. It please.
So thank you. It's wonderful. I'm curious whether there's what you think about the situation with Turkey and the creation of what I sort of myself think of as an axis of illiberal regimes with Iran and so on, and whether there's any indication that in vis-a-vis Turkey they're sort of putting Ukraine to some extent behind them. I mean, I almost think that there's a way that they're sort of saying this is a hopeless situation. We're going to try and create this new set of relationships, and whether you have a comment on the flip-flop.
Very fast. You need a real expert on these issues, but very fast from what I'm watching. Firstly, we shouldn't exaggerate, just like we can't believe any kind of Russia's pivot to China. We shouldn't exaggerate any basis, any platform for any kind of marriage or possibility of bedfellows with Rouhani and Erdogan. Well, everybody during the Sochi meeting pursued his own goals. And when one looks at their collective photo session with Putin behind Rouhani and Erdogan just distant from Putin, he doesn't want even to look at Putin. Rouhani is looking at Putin with some kind of distaste. Well, this reflected very much problems between the three sides. Several problems I will just mention. Iranians are pretty unhappy with Russians because, in fact, Putin wants to be the king peacemaker, whereas Hezbollah and Iranians were the real boots on the ground. and where they meet, and they lost a lot of people and blood. And they will need, according to Iranians' estimates, much more input and much more leverage over the final peace, I would say, peace format in Syria. So there are serious problems between Russians and Iranians. This is firstly. Problems between Russians and Turks, well, there's so many of them. Everybody plays his own game. And especially after Russians last year gave, I could be, when I deal with more than 4 zeros, I don't remember, but at least pretty nice sum of money Russia gave to Kurds. Kurds are pretty often visitors in the Kremlin. And do you think that having Kurds in pockets and be friendly to Kurds, Putin can have trust of Erdogan? Come on. So everybody apparently has his own goals over there, and Erdogan is helping Crimean Turks. Well, there's so many in this box. But, you know, this is temporary alliance that apparently, well, has one purpose. Everybody has agreed in Sochi, at least tentatively, for its own control of the fragmented Syrian territory. Syria has been divided, and in a sense, it's a new Yalta, okay? The problem is now to get approval of the United States of America. And Americans, as we know, they have not only 5,000 people, soldiers, very good, elite soldiers, where they cooperate with Kurds. They have around 15,000, they will bring more, they're paying Kurds, and this basket, you know, is full of snakes.
Thank you. It's Pete and then Mark. Yeah.
Pete Brown, Ukrainian Research Institute, a comment and then a question. I mean, just my period of historical concentration was a bit different, but looking back at people, rulers like Ivan III, Peter the Great, Lenin and Stalin, who engaged in domestic social class disciplinary measures, creation of new service strata in order to bolster state strength. My impression is that Putin, by and large, has been unable to do this, and I'm not saying that because of that, that has been an encouragement or an inducement for him for his foreign adventures. But I have regarded for quite some time as that being a major failure of his. My question is, do you feel that one factor for why Russia is involved in Syria is to maybe distract Western attention from Ukraine?
Yes, of course, absolutely. I agree. This was the first goal, and then when Putin took the decision, some other motives, you know, have been included, like let's test, you know, our military weapons. Let's test, you know, our pilots, etc. Let's return to the Middle East. Well, why not? Let's, tease Iranians and etc. Well, so many other second-rate goals. Well, but the first goal is let's forget about Ukraine. Yes. Well, I simply wonder to what extent we should compare Putin to Ivan the Terrible and the rest.
No, I didn't say
You said
Ivan.
Ivan.
No, I'm just thinking, you know. Okay,
Thank you.
I agree.
Mark, please.
fully.
With regard to sanctions, Lilith, I was wondering there are major complications in getting them lifted. So if Putin wants to get them lifted, it's not clear to me that anything he does is really going to do it, because first of all, there are separate sanctions you enacted in connection with the annexation of Crimea, and then several rounds of sanctions in regard to the conflict in eastern Ukraine. And that was on the part of both the United States and the EU, but at least with the financial sanctions, the one that really matters are the US sanctions. But then, more importantly, is that the Obama administration enacted the sanctions through executive orders, whereas, as you know, the Congress earlier this year, out of mistrust of the Trump administration, put it into legislation. And that makes it much harder to lift because it has to be done through congressional action. And, if you bear in mind, for example, with the Jackson-Vanik amendment, which took 41 years to lift, long after it had lost its purpose. So, and that had to do, again, because of congressional opposition for irrelevant things. So it's not clear to me that that's going to be much of an incentive to do anything about Ukraine, because I'm sure that a lot of figures in the Kremlin look on earlier experience with sanctions and realize that if it has to be done through congressional action, it's not going to get done, especially because the sanctions in connection with Crimea are not going to be lifted unless the Congress somehow decides that it's going to accept the annexation of Crimea.
Mark, thank you so much for comment. Could I make a very brief comment to Mark's comment?
Sure, absolutely.
I agree with your logic, but I would like to add, in this impressionistic picture, a couple of brushstrokes. Firstly, I wonder to what extent the Kremlin folks and Putin are so naive that they believe that they could get rid, for instance, of Crimea sanctions. But Crimea sanctions, I've analyzed them together with a group of people, they could be reproduced without much harm, okay? Well, they're in fact very limited. Secondly, to what extent Putin hopes that they will get rid of sectorial sanctions that are really important, European sectorial sanctions. Well, I don't think that Putin's advisors are telling him, you know what, in the next 6 months, EU will not reproduce, will not update them. I'm not sure that they believe that. Thirdly, I do believe that they hope that the so-called Siemens formula could be implied and reproduced. And here what they have in mind, there are so many loopholes in the mechanism of implementation of both European sanctions and sanctions that apparently will be reproduced by Americans, including the executive order sanctions that have been codified by the Congress. When I'm talking about Siemens loopholes, it means that, for instance, any Western company that cannot deal, for instance, with Gazprom in Siberia, cannot give technology to Rostech, cannot give the oil drilling equipment to Rosneft, okay? These companies have possibility to create daughter companies with some minor Russian participation and do what Siemens did, delivering pipes to Crimea. Okay? So there's so many loopholes in this kind of fragmented, and the Westerns, if they're serious, they have to delete these loopholes. But Europeans intentionally, together with Americans, left these loopholes because, firstly, they don't want to aggravate Putin's regime. God knows what will happen. Secondly, there is another, it seems to me, you can tell me whether I'm wrong or right. In fact, the West is not ready for serious damage and collapse of the Russian economy, because otherwise, what these guys will do. And regarding, but at the same time, there is one more important thing. I don't believe very strongly in the power of sectorial sanctions and sanctions that are probably will be implemented towards very much towards the companies of Chemizov, for instance. I do believe in personalized package. In the package directed against private people, 70 people that are on the list. This could be apparently a very powerful instrument that will tell the Russian elite, Putin is not anymore guarantee of your well-being. So I very much hope that this list will be implemented. But I am very grateful for your explanation.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Recently, there's been some discussion of some fraying of the SALT agreement and some counteractions on the U.S. Could you speak to that? I don't know the details, but
Of the
the strategic arms limitation.
Oh, Dima, will you explain us?
Another-
I will.
another
I will
time.
just before Dima as an expert.
This is not the place.
Salt has long been out of the.
Not
fact.
salt, but
You know,
To start.
INF.
INF. This is INF, intermediate range missiles. In fact, Dima will explain more in an expert way. We don't know to what extent Russians really undermined the INF treaty, which is one of the most powerful and serious elements of the nuclear security. Well, Dima will tell us to what extent, the speculations that SS-300, SS-400 are in Kaliningrad area, But the problem is that the whole Russian expert security community is talking about that nonstop, considering it's a very serious thing. And the whole community is trying to persuade, the Russian public opinion on TV and elsewhere that this is the American side that started the first, and we only have to respond. But Dima knows much more about INF and whatever. Simply, I'm watching the dialogue, among our people.
We all are, but I don't want to take the time now.
Okay,
There's
okay.
more
Okay,
questions.
thank you. Yes, please.
It's a continuation of Mark's question. Don't you think that Russia is ready to sell Malorossia, or Donetsk definitely, in order to get Crimea stable and no sanctions because of Crimea? Could it be this way?
A lot of my colleagues from the so-called Russian mainstream, serious experts, simply they don't like to antagonize Kremlin. They still believe that this kind of exchange and trade-offs, forget about Crimea, just forget, okay? And we are going to leave Donbass, do whatever you want, simply incorporate Donbass into Ukrainian belly, whatever, we'll be happy. I do believe that firstly, Putin is not ready with this purified form of the bargain, because still the domineering idea in Moscow, we have to influence Ukraine from inside, in this way or that way. Still, the idea is that probably because the West is weak and maybe fragmented, maybe there is a kind of loophole that we could make consensus, make a bargain on the basis of the peacekeeping forces, and get the West to agree that will influence the combination, the results of the elections in Lugansk-Donetsk, especially when we turn it into one republic, Transnistria, okay? And then, we can get rid slowly, gradually from Ukraine, and it's up to Ukraine and the world community to take care of this devastated area. So there is no, this key idea, as you mentioned, there is no this idea in the Kremlin. And regarding the West, I'm not so sure. It's up to the experts here. I'm not so sure that now, after what we had, what kind of experience we had this year, after Russia became so toxic for American political life, Sergei, what do you think? To what extent the West will accept this super cynical idea? If we have Berlusconi in Italy, Sarkozy or Chirac in Paris, Brexit is out, whatever. Even Blair is in London, advisor of Nazarbayev, Aliyev, etc. And if we have Schroeder again in Berlin, then this kind of cozy deal is possible. But we have other people over there, and we have Macron, and Merkel is still not in the retirement house. And Trump cannot do it because it will definitely mean subpoena, and Mueller will get him into his pocket. So I don't believe that the West is ready for this deal. I could be wrong.
I certainly agree with you on that. I don't think it's possible. It's possible from the Western side, at least at this point. Yes, please.
This may be just an opinion, or what chance is there for an uprising in Crimea?
Oh, I don't know. Folks, the Ukrainian Institute, could you give us?
I don't think that chances are high. Let's put it that way. Well, we still have probably the last question.
Okay, it's a quick question about Russia's symbolic politics. Simply
Igor,
because-
you should explain it to us. Come on.
No. It's just one little question. Simply because I'm currently writing something of this. It's in Russian symbolic politics. at one point in your talk, you referred to the frantic efforts by the Kremlin ideologues to cast Putin as the present-day peacemaker. What do you think? Can these efforts be connected to the recent unveiling of the monument to Alexander III in Livadia? Alexander III being, of course, known as the Tsar peacemaker.
Nina already, Igor, it's not a question, it's a comment. Nina already responded to you. But those who haven't seen the photo of this kind of monument,
Oh my God.
yes, yeah,
It's also the
yeah,
Chavez money.
yeah.
You know, that they got the Chavez Prize in Venezuela for being the peacemaker. That's, I think it's happening, they're trying to create that in many places.
Yes,
Is time for one more?
Absolutely last
Okay.
question, comment.
When you were talking about the causes, the reasons for Russia intervening in Crimea and Ukraine, you didn't mention one reason that's often mentioned, which is the fear of color revolutions and this, contagion effects and so sort of thing, either coming to Russia after or just as a demonstration for Russian opposition. Do you think that wasn't really much of an issue, or do you have some other reason for not talking about it?
Dima, as I remember, I said that the Kremlin had to respond to Yanukovych collapse because of this, because Eurasian idea and because of fear of repetition, Maidan, whatever. But I decided that I would mention two factors or two drivers that made all previous factors and fears viable and important. And I'm still, as I said, I'm still deliberating, and the more we have information about this dramatic period, maybe the more we'll have food for some other conclusion. At the moment, in November 2017, on the basis of what I know, what my friends know, on the basis of Moscow discourse and our understanding of the Kremlin, it seems to me it's our already common understanding that these two factors, Putin's legitimacy and the Western readiness to backtrack, they were most important as impetus. But of course, there were all other fears and worries, but these two impetus, made the whole situation possible.
It's interesting because among the people I talked to, and especially in Washington, initially there was very much this perception that the domestic politics, the legitimacy part, was driving it. And over time,
they changed.
That has been de-emphasized
Yeah.
in favor of this fear of the West.
Dima, it's very important that you mention it because, this is our kitchen constant narrative between us. Why and how the Western experts, in current case, Washington experts, start to get influenced by our Russian mainstream talk, very often. And especially it goes through the journals probably. If journals are talking to all Russians and Russians are saying, this is color revolution, this is fear of color revolutions, etc., it becomes already the Western narratives. So how to exclude possibility of being influenced by this virus, that's a very important thing. I don't believe that in the fall of 2014, Putin was so much afraid of repetition of Maidan, so much. In the future, yes, that's why Rosguardia, okay? Apparently it is in his head. Apparently it is somewhere in his head, definitely.
Well, after 2011.
Yes, after. But the impetus, the driving force was legitimacy, how to keep this power. Well, it's interconnected. Of course it's interconnected.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, unfortunately, we really ran out of time now, and I was looking for the way to end this on a positive note. And a student of mine sent me this doll of Mikhail Gorbachev. I don't know whether any of you remember that or not. And there is a very interesting statement. I believe that in the 21st century, the Soviet Union will be a profoundly democratic state. But it's interesting that the most optimistic notes that sounded today were about the changes in the Russian public opinion. And despite the fact that really the situation is really very, very difficult and the war is going on, Russia today is probably more democratic than the Soviet Union was back in 1985 or 1980, and to a degree that we are looking for the silver lining, for some optimistic solution. Again, the hope lies with the Russian public and with the Russian people. So, thank you very much for.